When did you meet Alexandre Luria, the man with who wrote The Man with a Shattered World, a neuropsychologist, Russian? When did you hear about him? How did this come about?
I remember it very well. It was in August of 1977. Somebody gave me a copy of his book, The Man with a Shattered World, because I was talking about my struggles. And this person thought maybe I would be interested in this book. And it was a story of a Russian soldier who had a very localized bullet hole wound in World War II to part of his left hemisphere. And when I started to read this man's life, it was like he was living my life and I was living his life. I knew I didn't have a bullet to my brain, but I knew from reading his experience that part of my brain wasn't working, and it was the same part as his. He couldn't tell time. I had never been able to tell time.
On an analog clock.
On an analog clock. And he had been able to before. He couldn't understand mathematics now. He couldn't make connections. He couldn't understand something being smaller than something or bigger than something. I couldn't understand those kind of relationships or connections. So now I knew where my problem was. I mean, before I'd always known I had a serious problem, but I didn't know the reason. And before you can create a solution to something, you have to understand what the source of the problem is. So now I knew it was part of my brain that wasn't working. And around the same time, I came across the work of Rosenzweig, the psychologist at Berkeley that was one of the early people looking at neuroplasticity, but with rats. And he found that if you put rats in a really stimulating environment with lots of toys to play with, they became better learners, and their brains had changed physiologically, like more neurotransmitters, more dendrites, the branches that allow for better connection, enlarged capillaries, so more blood flowing to the area. And I had to believe that hopefully humans had more neuroplasticity than rats, even nobody was looking at it.
God willing.
I hoped. So I thought maybe I could stimulate and work my own brain to improve those, those problems, and that was the beginning of my work.
So intelligence was not your issue, IQ was not your issue, brain disorder was your issue.
Very much. Parts of the brain that were not working.
How did you figure out which parts?
Well, the first part was the same area that Zizetsky had. So by understanding what he couldn't do, I knew it was part of the brain in the left hemisphere, which is called the angular gyrus. And it's a really important part that processes information to attach meaning to it. So for me, I mean, there was all this information out there, but it was like a booming, buzzing confusion. Nothing ever came together to make connections, like cause and effect, why things happened. Nothing made sense in my world because everything was fragmented and disconnected. And that is the part of the brain that makes those kinds of connections where, when we have insight, we go, aha, like it's all these pieces come together into a whole. Well, nothing ever came together for me. So once I discovered that one part of my brain, then I started to think about, okay, why am I so clumsy? What's going on there? Well, that's another part of the brain that registers sensation. And then I thought, okay, my spatial problem where I'm always getting lost, what's that? And I went back and read in Luria and discovered that was a different part of my brain. So I had to create exercises for 3 very different parts of my brain.
How did you know how to do that?
Well, I didn't initially, but I thought, if I could figure out what does that area do through looking at Luria's work, and the first exercise I created was using clocks. Not that I wanted to get better at telling time, but if we think about a clock, it's a relationship. You have to understand the relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand. I wanted to force my brain to process relationships because that's what it couldn't do. So I started with a 2-handed clock and just started drawing clocks, reading them. I mean, initially I was really not very accurate. I had a friend help me. And eventually I got really fast at that. And then I went to a 3-handed clock because, I wanted to force more relationships, and a 4-handed clock. And at that point, I knew something had changed. Once I was able to read and understand the relationships on a 4-handed clock, I could now actually listen to people talking and understand as they were talking, and I'd never been able to do that before. I could open a book and read a page and understand it as I was reading it. Before, I might have to read that page 40 or 50 times. It was remarkable. I could go in and look at mathematics and I could actually understand it rather than just have to memorize it.
How many different brain deficits, brain disorders are there, approximately? Give me some examples.
Okay, currently I can work on 19 different areas. So the one that I talked about with the clocks, which is reasoning, processing information. Another one is the individual can't read nonverbal cues. So the individual that's awkward, they're just socially awkward, right? They miss those cues. They can't plan very well socially.
So you mean they walk into a room and they have no idea if people like them or if they're appropriate?
Exactly. Or they walk into a room and they look at a situation and say, oh, I'd like to go over and interact with those people, but they have no idea how to do that. Like they can't create a plan, and then they can't read the feedback that, oh, yes, exactly.
Can't read body posture.
Body posture, voice tone. You know, it's a person that, you know, they may be talking too much and the other person's eyes are rolling up in their head saying, I wish you would stop this, but they don't read those cues. So we have programs for that area.
So if you went to Japan, for instance, say you go to Japan, you have no idea about the culture and you're North American.
Yes. So it would be, you know, stepping back and you know, trying to interpret what are those cues. But if you have no familiarity with that, you would have a difficulty. So it would be sort of like that person's experience in their own culture.
Sure, because in Japan you don't look people directly in the eye necessarily, you don't touch people, and in North America you pat people, look them in the eye, and so to relate to it, be something like that.
It would be having that kind of experience.
That kind of experience.
Yes.
And as a child, we all know children who blurt things out and don't seem to have an edit point and ask a million questions, and you're saying that could be a deficit in the brain.
It could be. I mean, it isn't necessarily bad behavior, which often people interpret it as. It's exactly that part of the brain isn't working. And I work with adults as well, and you see, you know, I had one adult that had a problem with auditory memory, like they couldn't retain what they were hearing, and he was a pilot. And his strategy was to get the air traffic controller to repeat the instructions over and over and over again because he couldn't remember them the first time. And that was a little worrisome that he was up there flying a plane, and I used to think what would happen if the air traffic controller was really busy and couldn't repeat the instructions. Now, we address the problem so he won't make that mistake, but there are all these things that we think of as accidents, like human error, and at times it can be what I call a cognitive mismatch, that person's unique cognitive profile of strengths and weaknesses doesn't match the demand of the task that they're in.
Of all the people you write about, there's a case study in the book of one woman who could not recognize her own baby.
Yes.
People who go to movies and don't know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy.
Absolutely, they can't recognize the faces, so they can't. Yes, they don't remember who that face belongs to.
Right, was that the good guy or the bad guy?
Yes.
Or the villain?
Yes, yes. I mean, or I have a friend that has this problem, and she's viewed as being cold and snobbish, and she is the warmest person.
Just doesn't have a clue.
She walks by people like her neighbors on the street. She'll recognize them if they're on the porch of their house because she recognizes the house. But as soon as they step off that porch and walk by her, she doesn't know who they are, so she doesn't say hello, and she gets that reputation.
Yes, uncanny. We'll be back with Barbara Arrowsmith-Young, the woman who changed her brain. And is she the one that didn't recognize her therapist?
Yes.